Welcome, everyone, to Days of Our Cyber Lives, a podcast series brought to you by the Indiana Bond Bank and the Indiana Treasurer of State's Office. As part of our Indiana Bond Bank Bondcast, we host this series to help local governments and professionals learn tips, tricks, and cybersecurity things to know as we move into this brave new cyber world, the Days of Our Cyber Lives. My name is Mark Wallner, the Executive Director of the Indiana Bond Bank, and I am joined as always by co-host, Treasurer of the State of Indiana, the Honorable Kelly Mitchell.
Hey, Mark.
Kelly, how are you?
I am well. Hope you guys are well. Everyone that's watching, if you're a regular viewer, you'll see we're joined by Shatrice Mosley Romero, the Cybersecurity Program Director at Indiana Office of Technology and Indiana Department of Homeland Security. This episode, we're flipping the script on Shatrice and asking her to share her cyber expertise. Welcome back, Shatrice.
Hi, I'm seeing a trend here, Kelly. I was, on the other side of the not co-host last month with the leadership podcast with Lieutenant Governor, and happy to serve on both sides. A little bit more nervous when it's a bit flipped on me, but I think I can do it.
No, we keep doing it because you're good at it. We've got a new face and voice with us today, and that is Ed Reiter, who is Executive Director of Statewide 911 Center. It is a huge part of the fabric of local government, our local 911 call centers. And as part of my role as State Treasurer, I chair the Indiana 911 Board. So Ed is a part of my team, and I am so excited to have him here to discuss the critical work that we do.
Well, to all of you guys, Mark, Kelly, Shatrice, it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about the Indiana Statewide 911 Board and what we do, and then also some of the impacts of what COVID-19 has had on the PSAPs for the last 12 months.
This is fantastic. Ed and I work in real life about, 30 feet down the hall from each other, so it's great to do this virtually, and it's just a great topic, really. It's very timely, very topical. Kelly, I'm glad you brought Ed here. I think whether you're in local government, like a lot of our audience, or you're just a regular citizen, it's it's really hard to picture anything more scary than if a 911 center were to get compromised with a with a cyber attack, or held ransom, or any of those things we've talked about. And if you're trying to get through the emergency call, just what the implications of that are. So I'm really excited, Ed, that you're here to join us, and Shatrice can provide the backup on the cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Ed, and Treasurer and Mark. Yeah, I mean, this is scary stuff, and it's not just stuff in theory. I'm sure we'll dig into it a little bit more. This is actually has and is happening in our local governments across the nation. It's most certainly a target. So it's, when you're messing with life and death situations, this is scary stuff. So just requires some good leadership, which we most certainly have in the state and at local government level. So I'm excited to dig a little bit deeper in this.
Maybe I can start, just maybe the question on everybody's mind, at least I know when I started working with you, Kelly and Ed down the hall, just how in the world does 911 find its way into the Treasurer's office in Indiana?
I get that question a lot, actually, because I am the only treasurer in the country who has the honor of serving in this capacity. But a little history, Indiana was actually the second place in the country to offer 911 services over 50 years ago, I think 55 years ago now. But the statewide 911 board was created in 1998, and the Treasurer of State was made the chair when the collection of the 911 fees was consolidated at the state level. And I feel very fortunate in Indiana that we have this structure because it works incredibly well. Our 15-member board is active and engaged, and we are really able to move swiftly and nimbly in response to evolving technologies.
Learned something already. That's fantastic. So, Ed, maybe to build on that, can you share a little bit about what your team does at the state level? Because I think when most of us hear 911, we think, okay, I pick up the phone, it's a local dispatch center, but it's not that you are receiving those calls on a state level. Can you share a little bit about what what does 911 do at the statewide level?
Well, certainly, Mark. But before I get into that, I do want to say, with the state 911 board, falling under the umbrella of the Treasurer's office really says a lot about the responsibility that we have and the where we really stand within the state. And as the Treasurer of the state, being the leader of that, and not only that as a position, but then working with Kelly Mitchell in her role. I mean, she has so many things on her plate. I don't know how she keeps up with everything, but she is very in tune with what's going on with 911. And if you're going to go to battle with someone, this is the person I want with me by my side. And she does a fantastic job on that. But to get to your point about the question itself, you know, I think a lot of people do think that there's major 911 centers or PSAPs, what we call public safety answering points. But in 2014, Indiana put into statute to consolidate public safety answering points to no more than 2 PSAPs per county, but there are exceptions in some of your larger counties because of universities or state police or something along that line. But there are 121 public safety answering points in the state of Indiana. 90 of those are primary PSAPs, which then there are 30 that are secondary, which would be like smaller police departments, and which also include state police districts. The state police reduced their 911 or their dispatch centers from 18 to 6 regional dispatch centers. So they are dispatching at a much broader scope. But so it is a big responsibility. They work together collectively. You know, we find that we share a lot of information between agencies to help each other learn from each other. But there's just has to be a big shout out to all of them and the work they've done over the last 12 months, especially with COVID-19 and what they've had. And then this next week, or the second week of April, is always set aside as National Telecommunicator Public Safety Week. And we want to remember them for the work that they do every day, because they are the front line of public safety.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many layers and levels to 911 with local, state, and in federal components, and public and private sectors working together. I really think it's a great topic for discussion here, and I'm glad we're doing it.
Yeah, my goodness, yes, I would certainly agree with that. And maybe before we could even dive into the business of 911, Ed, you know, if we can pick up a topic you mentioned to this group that's very relevant. We were chatting just before we kind of went live on this.
Yeah, that podcast green room accommodation that we do right before.
Well, we need to have a green room when we come back together and record these in person.
That's right. I'll be the person who sorts out the M&Ms by a different color for our guests.
Yeah, I like that. My favorite color is blue, by the way. So
okay. We'll get you the blue ones.
I'll take the green.
You guys are killing me. So
chocolate. Just give me the chocolate.
That's right. Any chocolate would be great.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think from Ed's perspective, and most certainly, I think, you know, a shout out to all the people, the frontline people, in, as he said, because, you know, we get a week devoted to it, but it really is a daily appreciation for our frontline people who are taking in information and all of that. So, you know, I think Ed's story is a good jumping off point, because it's something that could just happen to anyone, and regardless of where you're at or how many points or how it all works. And, you know, of course, we all want to simplify it, and it most certainly is more complicated. At the end of the day, when you pick up 911, you want it to get to the right people as quickly as possible, and that takes some coordination, and that takes some security around that as well. So you know, and I think if you can share with us broad strokes what happened recently with regards to you know, a cybersecurity issue, of course, without giving away the playbook, because we always want to learn from things, but not provide everybody who's listening, which could include maybe not so good people too, who are looking for ways to do it. But I think it's still important, you know, which is why we're so grateful that the Treasurer and Indiana Bond Bank does this podcast, is to kind of talk about how does this really affect us on the cyber side of things. And like we said earlier, it's happening. So Ed, I'm sure you have some good war stories that keeps you up at night sometimes.
Yeah, there are. I don't think we have enough time to really share all of them, but I will say, in this topic here with cybersecurity, you know, it's proven that there is no organization that's exempt here, because you know, we put all these measures in place to monitor internally through the technology side of this. But I think what we found in this particular case here, and keeping it very broad, is that you know, there was a compromise into our emails, to where they were actually sending emails from representing our agency to the vendor and vice versa. And there was some communication about changing ACH information, which But what really caught on to this more than anything was the fact that we communicated internally within our office with our policy that takes 3 people to check and balances to make sure everything is in place, and they were in place. And so it has caused us to, even at this point, not to become complacent of what we have, but also to continue to accelerate our cybersecurity measures as we go forward, so that we've caught this. We've made sure that it's, nothing is out of place, but it's still important to stay on top of it. And all the signs were there, all the warning signs that we're all taught about are there, and they were very obvious. But the people within our agency worked together to come up with this, to find out, to identify it, really. So that's pretty much it, keeping it broad without going into too much detail.
Yeah, we have talked about business email compromise on past podcasts, and I think some of those very first episodes. But Ed, I'm glad you're sharing this story with us, because it's a real life example of what can happen, even when we're watching for it and alert, paying attention.
And Shatrice, would love you to jump in. I know we just got a real high level, but a business email compromise effort to try to obviously divert some money into some bad actors' hands. Are there threads you would pull out for our listeners, or things you heard Ed say that his team did well, or triggers that other folks should look at if they're?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what I love about Ed's example is that, while it was an email business compromise and it seemed very, could be very believable, it's a very people focused type of thing, right? So what we've talked about before is it isn't really always about the tech. It's really about the processes that we develop and the policies we have in place. So the fact that, that they had several people checking it, and that is part of their ongoing process and their policy to verify and double check. And if somebody had a question, they brought it up and they talked about it internally. I mean, that is the key to so much of that. I mean, bad actors, cyber actors, are counting on people not talking to each other, especially right now with everything we've gone through this last, the last year, where we don't have somebody just 10 feet away and say, hey, did you just send this? People have to go through a couple of extra steps to verify those processes. And sometimes people, unfortunately do become complacent in those situations, and they're just like, oh, I'm sure it's fine. And that's one of the reasons, actually, in this last year, we've seen the ACH fraud that he was talking about, where people are saying, hey, we just changed our banks as vendors. Here's a new bank information. That actually has increased in the hundreds of percent, because people, bad actors, again, are counting on this kind of siloed effect that we find ourselves in since COVID. So, I think they handle it really well, and most certainly, even if you have good processes in place, you're still going to be targeted. And so the best thing you can do is be communicating with each other and really focus on training people what to look for, not just assume that your computer systems and technology is always going to catch it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Ed, can you, again, without giving away the playbook, can you talk for a minute about what you might change or what you've learned?
Well, I think the big thing, Kelly, that in this process is we're all working differently than we were pre-COVID. We're finding ourselves more in tune with all the Zoom meetings and all the things that we're doing electronically. And I think what we find ourselves trying to do, we know that we're getting behind on our emails, or we're getting behind on our work, and we're trying to multitask probably things that we shouldn't be doing, when we need to stay focused on the meeting at hand, because we need to make sure our attention, especially dealing with the finances of anything, is that you're giving 110% of reading those emails much closer, so that you can verify that you're not getting a phishing email, or all of those kind of things that go along with it, or the intensity of the emails, and all those kind of things that add up to that. But to slow the process down, 911 is an emergency that we deal with in operation centers and in public safety. It's not 911 because we have to delay a payment or something to be a couple of days behind. It's what's important is that we make sure that it's being delivered on time, and that we've made sure that all of our checks and balances have been taken care of, and that we've made it through without being hacked or being interfered of any sort. But I think again, just with my team, after talking to them about this entire incident, is don't let ourselves get caught up in trying to do too many things at one time, and let's slow our process down and be confident of our responses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd agree. Those are great teaching points, and I appreciate you sharing this, Ed. I know we talked about on the pre-call, was kind of a happenstance. You're going to be on this podcast, unfortunately, right around the time this happened, but really critical for our audience, I think, to remember. And Shatrice, thank you. It's a little scary. These have gone up thousands of percents, but probably not surprising. So let's get back to the business in hand, which was really IN 911 and the 911 call centers.
Yeah, I think, Ed, why don't you start by speaking on the impact of COVID-19 on our 911 PSAPs?
Well, you know, what COVID-19 has taught a lot of us, especially in the 911 world and really all of public safety, is that, you know, we train and prepare for all kinds of events and type of situations, but there has been nothing that's ever trained us to how we're going to handle a pandemic. And we rely a lot upon how we rely on support from supporting counties and agencies and so on and so forth. But when everybody's in that same bucket, they have to take care of themselves, and they had to learn that they had to build their COOP plans or continuity of operation plans to maybe a first, second, or even maybe a third or fourth level on how they're going to respond. And I think what we're finding from this COVID-19 event that we've been working through, and as things seem to be getting better now with the numbers, you know, and that we still have to get across that finish line. We're not there yet, but things are improving. Is that, you know, we are going to be stronger and we're going to be better for whatever kind of situation that comes at us because of what we've already been through here. We've not only, because of our technology that we have invested in 911 across the state and how Indiana leads the nation in so many areas, and especially the technology and our network, that we have the capabilities of building those COOP plans and those options for those dispatchers to take, whether it's through manpower or through technology. We're able to work with them a lot more. But what I can tell you is early on, there was a lot of attention to that, and then things kind of drifted off. And then in October, November, December, when we were finding that the PSAPs were being impacted personally, where there may be as many as 20 to 70% of their staff would be off at a given time to run 911 centers, and all 911 centers stayed operational, and all 911 calls were answered during the peak of this pandemic.
That is incredible, and a great testament to the work that our 911 operators have done through really crisis times. And it's a great learning point. I think you already touched on the continuity of operations plans, but I think for all of us, we probably have thought, again, you've covered, you know, what do we do if this particular site's shut down or fire, flood, or whatever those situations are, and can pull from adjacent counties. But, you know, now we've got to consider those bigger, broader statewide pandemic issues where there's really nobody else to pull from because we're all dealing with the same thing. So that's, you know, I think is me learning something from this, and hopefully others thinking about those plans on our side about what if the worst case comes to happen and how do we adapt to that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I would say from the COOP perspective, I like Ed's perspective of we've been trained in these like fires and tornadoes and something's out, and so you rely on people around you. But when a pandemic happens and people are not only trying to protect themselves, but they also are trying to do this, do their service to their community, and have to do it safely, but also have to do it short-staffed. I think it's amazing the amount of work that those people have done over this, and just literally putting themselves even at risk because of the importance of their job. But I also think when it comes to COOP planning, you learn so much, not only from the operations side of it, but, kind of tying this back to whether it's a pandemic, one type of virus, right, or a computer virus, you're looking at what we've seen, especially there's a lot of advantages to centralizing like they have done over the years for state police or for the 911 centers. But what happens, and this has happened in areas where full sections of states have been compromised because they are connected. And so, you just need one person to also knock out operations across the board where you can't easily just, now you have significant overflow and you're still dealing with, short staff and issues. And so I think the important thing with COOP, whether it's a, ransomware attack or different types of attacks or a pandemic, no matter what virus you're dealing with, to always have a plan. And even if it's not perfect, to have something, and I think back up your information is probably the number one thing, and make sure there's a good communication tree between your staff, because whether it's we need to shut down because of sickness in the center, or we need to shut down because nothing's working, you know, to have plans in place so that your staff knows how to handle it from there, to be able to continue to provide those services, which clearly we're all versatile. And I think, you know, us as just being the kind of servants that we are, we make it work, right? And I think that's definitely says a lot to the people who do that every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you made the point too, that despite being short-staffed and struggling, that I never heard of a situation where our call centers weren't able to respond to calls.
No, you're correct. And you know, when you think about, you know, the PSAPs themselves, it's one place that there's not the opportunity to work remotely. They've got to go into the centers. You know, they have to work under some conditions, or they're not able to social distance like, you know, some of your larger centers, especially your small ones. And so they have to be there 24/7, 7 days a week. And they have really worked through this admirably. I mean, I'm telling you that I think what we have found over this time, what it has also done for the state board, even though we're a home rule state, we don't dictate policy to the PSAPs, but we do help in a lot of ways about developing their plans and being there, that we've been able to collaboratively bring people together from all parts of the state to share those ideas so that they can make their centers stronger and learn from each other. And it's really been rewarding to see that kind of work and where we're at. As even though there's 121 different PSAPs out here, they're all working for the same mission and the same thing that's going on. So I think, thankfully, we haven't had anybody shut down because of that. There have been some really close situations, but what's been nice, but from the collaboration, or what's been rewarding, just to see other agencies even offer manpower to send to other centers to say, we can help you out if we need be. So they are willing to do that. But it's not only from that end of it, but then also from the technology side, being able to build additional options for them to handle and process calls.
Absolutely. And I think you nail it when you say collaboration. It has just been such a time of coming together and getting through this, that it doesn't surprise me, because I've met many of these dispatchers and directors, and they're wonderful. But it's really heartening to see as well. So let's talk for our last topic. Let's talk about the cyber criminals that are targeting 911 centers. Ed and Shatrice, I'll paraphrase from a 2018 NBC News article on this topic, that from 2016 to 2018, there were 42 publicly reported attacks on 911 call centers.
Yeah. Go ahead, Shatrice. I'll let you start off.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm glad you brought that up, and most certainly, it being an older article, the numbers definitely increased significantly. And about 2/3 of those attacks were ransomware, which, just to kind of remind listeners, ransomware is when somebody, much like a ransom of a person, you take over the computer systems operations or business information, a lot of the data that, you know, like, for example, these centers rely on to pull and be able to get people to help other people quickly. And then so a lot of those are that, and then you have to pay a ransom to maybe get your information back, and usually it's encrypted and scrambled, and it takes a while to basically decode. Or the other type, the other third, is DDoS attacks, which is denial of service, which basically means that cyber actors just flood the system with other calls, robocalls, to make sure that nobody else can get in. And so that's, you know, equally, you know, dangerous in the sense of course, life and death, every minute matters. And so, you know, they're just out to disrupt and make things hard. And local governments are absolutely the #1 target consistently, and that most certainly includes 911 centers, especially since it has a direct effect on life and health safety of the citizens.
So I hear you saying, Shatrice, I mean, really, so the first ransomware motivation is money, and then the denial of service, where they're just flooding a center with automated calls. What's the point? Are they looking to be paid? Is it just to be a pain, just to prove they can do it? Like, what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, it is purely to distract and disrupt, and to cause harm and make people question our own infrastructure. Especially when nation states are involved, but also just because people are just angry at the system or angry at the government or whatever their motivation is on the back end, or maybe they're just bored, and they like to be able to have that control. And when it's ransomware, they're getting paid for it. So now they're getting not only able to show that they can do something and hurt us and affect people, but now especially, and I think that actually was what makes 911 centers and healthcare and emergency personnel even more vulnerable than other government agencies, is because they're more likely to pay the ransomware because they don't have time to just maybe guess or figure it out. And so, it's almost kind of a very large percent of people who just go ahead and pay the ransomware. And now they've come out with a payday. So just like any business, right? They're smart business people. Why would you walk away from a good business model, right? So you have an increased amount of people spending a lot of money, and it doesn't even have to be a lot. Maybe it's like, if you do a whole bunch of them and 10,000 here, 10,000 there, 50,000, I mean, it adds up. I mean, these bad cyber actors are walking away with a lot of money, but they're also, causing a lot of damage and even possibly causing harm to people and even life and death situations. So it's most certainly a scary, scary situation. And I think, at least for me as a cyber director for the state, it's always something that keeps me up at night. I'm sure Ed is the executive director for 911. That's always something that you don't want to hear coming through your text or your phone, that there's an issue with computers. And so it's, just bad people doing bad things.
Right. And, we need to remember that whatever their motivation or type of attack, anything that prevents a legitimate call from coming into 911 is a serious threat to Hoosiers.
And we look back here, and just to go back in history a little bit, the very first 911 call in Indiana was March 1st, 1968. Think about the technology changes from that time on and where we're at. And the way that dispatchers are trained these days, they rely heavily on the technology and the resources available to them, but they also train on if there's enough redundancy in those systems to back up those systems internally, along with working just to the bare basics that they're going to answer those calls and get those calls dispatched and out in as quick as way they possibly can. So yes, we do rely on the technology. It's highly important because there's so much valuable information in there, because it's making it safer for the firefighters and the police officers and everyone going into these scenes for their own protection. But because of the redundancy, the calls are still going to be answered. They're still going to be delivered. And that's what the main thing is going to be in this whole process. But we rely so much on this, and you're right, Shatrice, that it is just to the point of, 911 centers, hospitals, things like that are high priority in these things, because they know if they can get to those, they can really cause an impact on society.
I was going to ask, with the high reliance on technology that Ed just mentioned and as Shatrice mentioned, these are things that just can't be down for very long. Are there different or specific preventative measures that centers should implement, local governments who have highly sensitive information should be implementing to prevent either ransomware or the denial of service type attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's just circle back to the good example that Ed provided earlier. Having good processes in place is a key thing. I mean, starting when it comes to cybersecurity, it shouldn't be an afterthought when something bad happens. It should be a forethought of when this is going to happen, because we are going to get attacked. Now hopefully we put these preventative measures and processes and policies in place that people are thinking about. This email could be a phishing email, and if I click on it, I take down the whole system, and that is as simple as it can be. So training the people on what to look for in these phishing attempts, that has these codes to execute, whether it's a ransomware attack or a DDoS attack, is super, super key, because the majority of cyber attacks happen because of human error, not because the technology is not up to date. And then the other thing is, a lot of times if you are a victim of ransomware, and you've backed up your system, and you back it up not like 3 months ago or every quarter, but you back it up daily, you back it up hourly, or whatever the case may be, depending on the service you provide, which I imagine in this case much more frequently, then you can frankly get a ransomware attack. You don't have to pay, because you can just backtrack it on those situations and be able to kind of basically wipe clean and stuff. Not that that doesn't take time, but it most certainly doesn't cause more problems. And then obviously the fear of you pay something, you don't get everything back, or you get it back, but it takes you several days to basically take down the encryption that these cyber criminals do, because again, even if you pay them, they still want to disrupt the system. So I think the basics of basic securities, making sure that people are trained in phishing attempts and social engineering, making sure that, as Ed said, as the technologies increase, that you're asking your vendors, how are they securing their information. So much things are on the cloud. So where are things being held? Are they being held here in the US? Or are they being held by nation states that are not our friends? So more than likely that's a problem. Those kind of questions people should be asking, no matter what part of local government you're in, as we increase our technology and our vendors. Because really, when it comes to local governments, the two ways in that is most successful for bad actors is the people. So through them, counting on them to not talk to each other or know how to catch a bad phishing attempt, or through the vendors, who are also ran by people who are also not trained, and they're usually small shops or whatnot, and so they don't have all the time and stuff. But this is worth the time to take a minute, verify what you get, and then make sure you ask questions of vendors that if you're going to pay for the service, you should know.
Thank you, Patrice. Can we go back to that NBC News article I mentioned? It talks about one of the most well-known 911 center cyber attacks that was in Baltimore. I don't know, Ed or Shatrice, can you talk about what happened there and any lessons learned?
Well, what I can tell you on that, from what I know of that particular case, is that they actually attacked the computer-aided dispatch system, which is that tracks all the calls that come in. When a person calls 911, the dispatcher will then log in the location, the nature code, or what type of call it is. It has a response plan already built into that, and gives that initial dispatch out, and it restricted the access into the files, which a lot of centers do train without those centers, without that capability to them, because they know that if it does get knocked out because of weather or whatever, they got to be able to still get the calls out. But what's critical about that is the officer safety information that's in those systems. So when that impacted, it did have a high impact on it. And Shatrice, you may be able to speak more on what the ransomware and all that came about through Baltimore and how that came about. But that's all that I know, that what was impacted there in Baltimore.
Yeah, I think that Baltimore was a good example of the situations where, enforcement, much like, unfortunately, like, ransoming of family members, right? They're always going to say, don't pay the ransomware. But that gets so complicated when you are dealing with life-death situations, and you really are, and I believe, if I recall, the ransomware amount was $50,000, around that. And, whether or not they, and I believe they paid it, right, Ed? I think they did pay it. Now, of course, there comes risks to paying it, right? So you pay it, but now you're known in the cyber actor world as somebody who will pay. So they do see sometimes an increase on people who go back. So one of the things I would say, if you're ever attacked and you pay, you better go back and fortify your systems, because you're going to get attacked again. And there are some people who don't learn, or they realize, okay, we're past it, and they don't, they don't really correct the way, the reason why it got in, including training. But I also think, I think we talked about this a little earlier, and Ed, to the point of people being trained in case it gets knocked out. They were knocked out for quite a bit. And so they had to go back to the good old fashioned days of manually dispatching. And so, I would say that as technology and upgrades of equipment happen, that people don't overly rely on how great that technology is, because it is great, but you have new people come in, you should always revert back to what if we don't have this? How are you going to get information quickly to those who need it so you can help those who need it the most? So I think it's important to always kind of keep that in mind as you're updating equipment and you're looking at technology, and to always train and ask the questions and backup. So that's important stuff.
Well, you nailed it, Shatrice, about the updating equipment. We have not become complacent here in Indiana about upgrading equipment. We're in the process now of building out the 2 separate EZNets, emergency services networks that are interconnected, that we'll have with 2 vendors that are working together, that will be able to serve as backups to each other. So if one should be taken out, the other one can back up the other one. And we are very proud of where we're at, because when we look across the country, a lot of states are looking at late 2022, early 2023, and we'll have both of our EZNets completely built out by June of 2021. And it will allow more capacity and more availability for 911 calls to come in. The old trunk legacy system will go away, and it's a continual thing to continue to operate at the highest level of 911. And I think the citizens of Indiana can be proud of the investments that we're making in the technology side of this, and that we're always upgrading the equipment. And it just seems like as soon as you get it in, you got to think about what's coming up next, and you got to stay current with it, just like you have to stay current with the latest technologies in monitoring cybersecurity coming into your businesses. Absolutely.
Yeah, it definitely is hand in hand. As new equipment gets updated, so much of that also has that new technology to better protect our systems. So I'm so glad I've always been proud to hear Indiana's always ahead and in front of those things. And I think it's something that people should definitely be proud of and know that they are really being taken care of, even if you don't see it every day.
Ed, you're doing wonderful work. And, I hear equipment and upgrades, and it's rare that we get on and talk about bond bank programs, but it is a natural segue into a program that we have, which is small equipment leasing financing through the bond bank, which is available to local governments, whether it's hardware, computers, even police vehicles, as we get farther afield from just the 911 call centers. The bond bank has a program that has some legislative advantages to go through. So we exempt some needs for you to bid the financing locally. We matchmake you with a portfolio of 12 different banks who then compete for your business to provide the lowest equipment financing rate. And today, we get this unknown COVID time where maybe in the past you'd just spend cash up front on a piece of equipment. But we're seeing a lot of our communities, schools, libraries decide to kind of spread the costs out of those assets over the useful life at relatively low financing rates. As we know, interest rates are very low. And so just a small pivot into a bond bank program, the HELP program. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can submit a non-binding inquiry. We can give you a sense of what rates are like, and we'd be glad to help any listeners on the call.
Awesome, Mark. I'm really glad you got to talk about the HELP program. It is really an amazing resource for communities. And Ed, thank you for joining us. You mentioned at the beginning wondering how I get things done, and it's because I surround myself with very smart and dedicated people like yourself, and I get to see how you work on a regular basis, and really glad that we could share a tiny piece of your knowledge with everyone listening here. You guys, I'll just shout out, Ed does a phenomenal job. I'm proud to work with him.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this podcast today. I've enjoyed it, and again, I love working with all of you guys as well.
Thank you. And Shatrice, how was it sitting in the guest chair?
I think I could get used to it for sure. I find that I like talking. So as anybody probably who knows me can figure out. But and Ed, thank you too. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Kelly, but Ed actually does serve on the governor's executive council on cybersecurity. He's been an advisory member for whenever we need to get into it and figure out. Thankfully, we haven't had any major incidents that have occurred. Call him. So I'm really glad that hasn't happened, right, Ed? But at least if something bad happens, we all know each other. You definitely don't want it to be a crisis before you actually meet somebody. So yeah, really grateful for Ed and the members and you guys. So thank you for having me.
It's always good to have you. And for the record, I did not, as the host, hit the mute button as you were going. That was That was Shatrice. She hit her own mute button, so it's not in response to she likes to talk.
I was wondering what happened there for a second. So
My hands are up here.
just start going like that. We're up here.
Yep, my hands are up here. So this is Mark Wollner. I will close it out. I'm the executive director for the Indiana Bond Bank. I want to say thank you for listening to us and treating this as the resource that's intended. We love bringing you different guests and different content on this very critical topic of cybersecurity. And so whether you watch us on YouTube, follow the Bond Bank there to get every episode as it gets posted, or if you listen on the podcast form, whether it's Apple Podcasts or any of your favorite podcast platforms, subscribe, and these will pop up as they get posted. So I will sign off from the Indiana Bond Bank. This is Mark Wollner. Thanks for listening.
And I'll say thank you for listening. This is State Treasurer Kelly Mitchell signing off this episode of Days of Our Cyber Lives for the Indiana Bondcast.